I have always felt that a thin veil separates me from the world unseen. Since childhood, I would fill my notebooks with strange drawings, faceless visages, doors leading into utter darkness. I was never the type to gather a crowd of friends. I was always a one-friend person, and sometimes no one's. When my parents separated, I was 8 years old. Everything I thought was stable crumbled. I fell into a long silence, and withdrawing from the world became my only way to survive. We moved to live near my mother's family in a small suburb of Portland, Oregon. The house we inhabited was adjacent to the home of my grandmother, Margaret, and her husband, Richard, separated only by a narrow alleyway and a few concrete steps. My mother spent most of her time there, while I preferred to remain inside my small space, entirely alone. One night, I dreamed of a man sitting at the edge of my bed. He had no face in the true sense, as if his features had been erased from the inside out. He stared toward me without moving. I woke up trembling, the air around me thick and heavy like velvet. I couldn't bear to be alone for another second. I rushed to my grandmother's house and sat right next to her, struggling to breathe. I told her there was something in my room. Margaret looked at me with eyes that were unsettlingly calm and said coldly, "Of course. 2 women died in that house, one in her sleep and the second a week after the first. We didn't even know until the smell started." She said it as if she were merely discussing yesterday's weather. I grew up. My mother remarried, and when my grandfather, Richard, moved to a more modern apartment about 200 meters away, I found myself alone in his old house for over a year. It was a 2-story house, filled with enough corners and alcoves to hide everything you didn't want to see. I knew my grandfather's new apartment was close, but the night made it feel like it was in another part of the universe. And there, I saw the shadows. Out of the entire house, I only used 3 rooms: the kitchen, the living room, and the bathroom. I never approached the other areas willingly. I was preparing my graduation project at the time, and rarely went outside. Loneliness, exhaustion, and isolation intertwined until the sensation of being watched became a constant, uninterrupted presence. The house had 2 long corridors. The first led to the bathroom, while the second stretched toward a large, locked room that my grandmother used to store old family furniture. At night, that corridor seemed to swallow space itself. There was no door at its end, only nothingness. I never went near it, yet I always knew when the entity was approaching. I would feel it in the back of my neck before hearing any sound. At exactly 2 or 3 in the morning, the knocking would begin. Heavy, rhythmic, successive thuds against that locked door at the end of the dark hallway. I would shove my terror deep into my chest and stay in the living room, locking its door and wedging a chair beneath the handle, just like people do in the movies. The television wasn't for entertainment, it was a defensive line. One night I fell ill. A severe fever made everything blur and shake. I woke up around 3 a.m., trying to remember where I was. Then I saw the chair move, slowly, as if an invisible hand was quietly sliding it away. The door creaked open slightly, and through the gap, I saw a dark, small silhouette peering in. It wasn't human. It was something else. I stood up and turned on every single light in the house. I wept. I tried calling my mother and my father, but no one answered. The time was nearing 4 a.m. I prayed until dawn, trying to convince myself that the fever was playing tricks on my mind. But the chair had definitely moved. 2 months later, I was watching a video online about supernatural entities in Celtic mythology, ghosts and beings caught between worlds called the fetch. It is said that a fetch is a person's double, appearing when their end is near or when a door is opened that should never be unlocked. The video ended with a sentence the speaker delivered in a mocking tone. And if you are watching this video right now, one of them might be watching you at this very moment. I laughed out loud and said, "That doesn't scare me." I should have known that regret wouldn't be my only punishment. That night, I lit a few incense sticks, a set I usually use to calm my nerves, and tried to sleep. At 2 a.m., I woke up. 3 shadows stood around my bed, one at my feet, one at my head, and the third was leaning directly over my face. They were emitting a sound, not a sound you hear with your ears, but one you feel deep within your teeth and chest bones. A low, steady, continuous hum, as if something mechanical was running inside the very walls of the room. I screamed with whatever voice I had left, "Leave me alone!" And they vanished, instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. After that night, sleeping at night died completely. I began staying awake until dawn, studying, cooking, playing video games, and only drifting off to sleep when the sun began to seep beneath the curtains. During one of those long dawns, I stretched out on the couch and dozed off. I entered a dream that felt nothing like a dream. I began to hear whispers. They weren't soft, nor were they slow. They were urgent and overlapping, as if many voices were speaking simultaneously from the depths of the walls. The closest way to describe it is the sound in the split second before something heavy crashes into the ground, the final second preceding the impact. The sound emanated from the second corridor, the hallway of the locked room. I walked toward it. Out of the darkness emerged a man. He was tall but hunched over, as if the air itself weighed heavily upon him. His eyes were wide open, far wider than they should be, and his hands hung unnaturally at his sides. He advanced toward me slowly. I began reciting prayers under my breath. At that exact moment, I heard the voice of my cousin, Ethan, screaming from somewhere behind me. "Run! Run now!" I wanted to move, but something was dragging me backward, as if a hand had snagged my shirt. I fought against it until I slipped free and fell to the floor. There was no air, only the desperate urge to escape a place I never wanted to return to. Then I woke up. The whispers were still echoing in my ears, a faint but lingering presence, like the tale of a dream refusing to detach itself. When my grandfather and grandmother came to stay with me for a few weeks, I thought things would settle down. My grandmother, Margaret, always slept with the lights on, an old habit she never abandoned. One morning, I woke up to find something standing in the room. It was a female figure the size of a child, but it was no child. Her stature was unnatural, elongated and far too tall for her proportions, and her eyes were stretched open to a terrifying degree. There was something resembling a smile on her face, but it never truly reached her eyes. In her left arm, she cradled something, a small creature with gray skin and limbs ending in far too many fingers. The creature wasn't looking at her. It was staring intently at my sleeping grandmother. I closed my eyes tightly and reopened them. They were still there. I tried to force myself back to sleep, not because the fear had faded, but because when the brain is entirely exhausted, it resorts to denial as a final survival mechanism. On another night, I was half asleep when I realized I was speaking with something. It wasn't a dream. It felt like a conversation taking place while I was semi-conscious. The voice didn't come from a distance. It came from somewhere incredibly close, perhaps from the very air itself. The words said, "Open the door. We will help you. Everyone you ever loved has left you. We never will." There was something in that voice that knew exactly where to strike. I truly was alone. I was exhausted and lost. A part of me wanted to believe it, but I didn't open the door. I opened my eyes and found myself crying in an empty room, in the dead of night, all by myself. I dreamed once more of a different place, a vast hall with walls made of dark wood, resembling a section of an old, abandoned commercial building. An old woman stood in the corner, wearing a heavy overcoat even though the air wasn't cold. She was asking me to let her in, her voice calm and steady at first, then growing increasingly urgent the more I refused. When she finally gave up, she exited the dream the way someone steps out of a room, quietly closing the door behind them. Then, another woman took her place. She pointed to her mouth and ears, gesturing to signify that she could neither hear nor speak. She just stood there, staring at me. I don't know which of the two was more disturbing. When my grandmother Margaret woke up one morning claiming that something had been running around her bed at night, throwing items and ripping the blankets off her, I didn't believe her at first. I thought that at her age, she was experiencing waking dreams. But one night, the entire house was jolted awake by her screams. When I reached her room, half of her belongings kept next to the table lamp had been burned. There was no logical explanation for it. The lamp wasn't a candle, nor was it a source of open fire. The plastic, the paper, and the cloth had all burned in a small, perfectly controlled circle, as if someone had mapped it out with meticulous care. When my grandmother left the following day, I felt as though something in the house had truly awakened, realizing that the perfect opportunity had finally arrived. Years passed. I graduated. I got a job in Dublin and left Portland behind. I moved into a shared apartment, taking a small room with a window overlooking an inner courtyard. One morning, at 5 a.m., I woke up to something covering my face. It wasn't heavy, and it wasn't a physical body. It was a white mist, thick enough for me to see its distinct borders. I stayed completely still and watched it. After a minute or perhaps more, the color slowly shifted into pitch black, and then it vanished. No explanation, no sound, no trace. And there's one final thing that must be mentioned. In 1998, my mother was 7 months pregnant with me. She and her Aunt Dorothy decided one evening to try and Ouija board, that tool some people use to communicate with the dead. They were attempting to reach their grandmother, Eileen, who had passed away 4 months prior. They say they spoke with her for about 40 minutes. She answered in a way that perfectly matched her personality, sharing small family secrets and details no one else could possibly know. Then everything stopped. The planchette began to move at a completely different speed, sharper, erratic, violent. The air in the room suddenly turned freezing cold, as if a window had been flung open by an unseen hand. The planchette began to spell out a single word, over and over again. Mine, 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 mine. They ended the session immediately. 3 weeks later, my mother was rushed to the hospital in an emergency. I was born 5 weeks premature. I was so small that I had to stay in an incubator for 2 weeks before she was finally allowed to hold me for the first time. As for the rest of the story, I think you already know it by now. When I was around 5 years old, the nightmares began. In the dream, I was always standing at the end of a long corridor in our apartment. The hallway stretched further than it had any right to, and although I could see pale light filtering from somewhere, the air itself felt soaked in darkness. My legs would sink into the floor, as if the wood beneath me had turned soft and hungry. I screamed until my throat burned, and nothing moved, and no one came. Then, at the very far end of the corridor, something would begin moving toward me. It was tall and wrong in its proportions, limbs too long for its body, shoulders that nearly grazed the walls on either side. Its skin was the color of an old bruise. Its fingers looked like they had one too many joints. Its eyes were pale yellow, and they glowed. Not metaphorically, but genuinely glowed, like something behind them was lit. I had this dream so many times that I eventually learned to recognize the moment the figure began moving. I would feel it before I saw it, and when I did, I forced myself out of sleep like a diver, kicking toward the surface. Every night, almost without exception, I told my father about it. He told me to stop reading before bed and to keep the television off after 9. He changed his mind when my younger brother Oliver started saying things that didn't belong in the mouth of a 4-year-old. Oliver was small for his age, but sharp. He noticed things. One night my father was doing their bedtime routine, the usual questions and songs, when Oliver went completely still in the middle of a sentence. He tilted his head to one side the way a dog does when it hears a sound no human can hear, and in a voice that was softer and older than his own, he said, "Daddy, something wants to know if you can see it yet." My father didn't sleep that night. Neither did I, because somewhere around 2 in the morning I opened my eyes, and there was a man standing beside my dresser. He looked entirely real. That was the first thing that terrified me. He wasn't transparent or blurred or flickering. He was solid, wearing a gray coat, standing with his hands at his sides, looking at me. I screamed and hit the light switch, and the room was empty. I kept the light on. I sat upright with my back against the headboard and watched the door until my eyes burned. I must have drifted off without meaning to, because the next thing I knew the room was dark again and the light had gone off on its own. He was back, but now I could see what he actually was. His skin was the color of something that had been left underwater. His teeth were wrong, too many and too long, and his eyes were a shade of gray that didn't exist in nature. He stood at the foot of my bed, and he looked at me, and he was smiling. Not a pleasant smile. A smile that said he had been waiting a very long time and was enjoying the fact that I now knew it. Then he laughed. It began quietly, almost politely, a soft chuckle that could have almost been mistaken for something benign. But it grew. It deepened. It got louder and more unhinged until his whole body was shaking with it, his head rolling back on his neck in a way that wasn't quite anatomically right. I couldn't move. My hands were flat on the mattress, and my mouth was open, and I could not produce a single sound. Then he stopped mid-laugh, snapped his head forward, and in a voice that was far too low and far too calm for what his face was doing, he said, "You can close your eyes if it helps, but it doesn't change anything." I pulled the blanket over my face. I lay absolutely still. I could still hear him, a low sound barely audible, like something humming to itself in a language that had no words. It felt like a very long time before the room went quiet. When morning came, I was still under the blanket. I told my father everything. He called my grandmother Eloise, who was deeply religious and knew people. She came with a man from her church, and they went through every room. Whatever they did, things became quieter after that. Years went by. I moved into the basement bedroom when I turned 12, and Oliver took my old room upstairs. The house was mostly calm, but starting around that time, without fail, every single night at exactly 3:15 in the morning, I would hear it. First a creak at the top of the basement stairs, then slow, deliberate footsteps descending, one step at a time. I would lie in bed and count them. There were 14 steps, and it always took 14 sounds before they stopped just outside my door. The handle would turn, the door would open, the room would sit open for somewhere between 1 and 3 minutes, and then the door would close again slowly, all the way, with a soft click, every night for 5 years. I never looked. I learned not to. We moved when I was 16. I had spent nearly my entire childhood in that house, and I thought leaving it would end things. For the most part, it did. The years that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't realized I was desperate for. But on the last night before the moving truck came, my father, Oliver, and I were all in the main bedroom, mattresses on the floor, watching something on a laptop. It was late August, and a storm had been hammering the city since midday. The power cut out just before midnight. We decided to sleep. We all woke up at the same moment. The room was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather or the absent air conditioning. The kind of cold that sits in the air like something breathing. And in the doorway stood a figure. It barely fit. Its head was bent slightly to avoid the frame, which meant it was well over 6.5 feet tall. We all made a sound at the same time, some collective involuntary exhale. Then I heard the laugh. Low, familiar, unmistakable. The figure leaned forward slowly, the way something does when it wants to be heard clearly, and it spoke in a whisper that carried the full length of the room. "New house," it said. "Say me." Then it was gone. Not slowly, not gradually, just absent. The way a thought disappears the moment you try to write it down. That was enough years ago now that I've built an entire adult life since. I live in Edinburgh with my husband Marcus, who works early morning shifts and is often gone before 4. I have a small house with a garden in the back and a narrow lane that runs alongside it. A few months ago I was outside late, just past midnight, standing near the back gate. It was a still night, no wind. I was about to go back, and when I saw it, a hand, long black fingers curled around the top of the fence that separates our garden from the lane. The fingers were too long. They were moving slowly, feeling along the wood in the way a person does when they're searching for a grip. But they weren't a person's fingers. I went inside and locked the door and sat at the kitchen table until Marcus came home. He was sympathetic, but I could see he was worried about me. Until last week, when he came in from the garden at midnight and sat down across from me at the table and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "There's something on top of the fence." He'd seen the hand, the long black fingers pressed flat against the wood, still, waiting. We haven't talked about what comes next. We both already know the shape of it. Whatever this thing is, it has never needed an invitation. It has never knocked. It has never asked. It has only ever waited until it was ready. And I don't think it's waiting much longer. I grew up in a Navy family, which means the concept of home was always temporary. Every 18 months or so, the boxes would come out of storage, new curtains would go up in a different house, and I'd start over again in another school where everyone already had their people. I have always been wired for anxiety, the social kind especially. So the cycle of losing whatever thin threads of friendship I'd managed to build was particularly brutal for me. This story takes place when I was 15, after we'd been stationed near a small coastal town in rural Nova Scotia for about 2 years. I had no friends. My parents argued constantly. I spent most of my time alone in my head, which was not a pleasant place to be. Our property sat on about 2 acres at the edge of town, and behind our back fence was a narrow creek, and beyond that creek stretched something like 800,000 acres of raw Canadian wilderness, threaded with old logging roads and overgrown trails. I knew those trails better than I knew most people. The forest was my default. It was a strange forest. I have other stories about what I found in there. A stone building with no doors and no windows. A section of trail where the birds went silent for exactly 40 paces in either direction. The collapsed remains of what looked like a children's school that no one I ever asked had any knowledge of. But those belonged to another time. It was early September. For almost a month my parents had been mentioning sounds from the tree line behind our property. Voices, laughter sometimes. My mother thought it was teenagers from town. My father checked the shed twice to make sure nothing had been taken. I had heard them too, usually in the late afternoon, sometimes carrying into evening. 2 or 3 voices calling back and forth across the creek, sometimes close enough to make out syllables, but never actual words. It wasn't frightening. Kids used those logging roads constantly, and given my particular relationship with strangers, I had zero interest in going to investigate. Then one afternoon, around 3 o'clock, the voices came again, and something in their tone was different. They sounded like they were genuinely enjoying themselves, laughing properly. I was sitting at my window doing nothing, which was my primary occupation that autumn, and I thought, almost involuntarily, what is so good over there? So I pulled on my boots and went to find out. I crossed the creek at the shallow point I always used, stepped onto the logging road on the other side, and walked maybe 4 minutes north before I found one of them. His name was Teddy. He looked about 13, so a couple of years younger than me, with a narrow face and wide-set eyes and a gap between his front teeth. He was wearing a windbreaker in a shade of orange that I can only describe as aggressively 1987. Actual shoulder seams, tapered jeans with the cuffs rolled up, big rubber boots that went nearly to his knee. His hair was parted and combed in a way I'd only ever seen in old-school photos. He looked genuinely startled to see me, but he recovered quickly and said hello, and I told him I'd been hearing them for weeks and had finally gotten curious. His face opened into a grin, and he said I had to come see what they were doing. He led me down a side path I'd walked a dozen times before, and into a clearing that shouldn't have been there. I want to be very specific about this. I knew that part of the woods. I had walked through it alone in every season. That clearing, roughly the size of a large living room, hacked out of a dense stand of young spruce, had not existed the last time I'd passed through. Not a week ago. It was brand new. 2 other kids were there. A boy my age named Rory, heavy-set with freckles, who shook my hand like an adult, and a girl about 17 named Sylvie, taller than all of us, with dark hair cut bluntly at the jaw. She was wearing a sweatshirt with the name of a band I vaguely recognized from my parents' record collection. They told me they were building a proper shelter. A base camp, Sylvie called it. Walls, a roof, a storage area. They'd already laid the frame of the floor, using birch trunks lashed together with thick rope. They asked if I wanted to help. I said yes before they finished the sentence. I had not been invited anywhere in 2 years. Now, about how they looked. I assumed at first that the clothes were hand-me-downs, the kind of thing you wore when your family didn't have much. But the more time I spent with them, the more I noticed that the clothes weren't worn. They weren't faded or fraying or soft with age. They looked new, crisp, like they'd come out of a bag that morning. The styles were decades old, but the fabric behaved like it had just been manufactured. Their skin was the same, clear and smooth, no blemishes, nothing. Teddy had the complexion of a boy who had never spent a single anxious night. I found it subtly disorienting in a way I couldn't explain and eventually stopped trying to. But they were genuinely kind to me. Not kind in the careful, managed way that people are when they're tolerating someone. Actually kind. They asked me questions and listened to the answers. They included me without making a point of including me. They argued with each other in the comfortable way of people who had known each other a long time, and they folded me into those arguments naturally, asking my opinion, accepting when I disagreed. We built something real over the following weeks. Walls of lashed spruce poles, nearly 2 meters high, a lean-to roof over the main section, a raised platform we used as a lookout, nailed into the fork of the largest birch we could find, a table made from split logs. By the time we were done, the place felt genuinely like somewhere. We were all proud of it. I was proud of something for the first time in years. One afternoon, sitting at the table, I asked Rory which school he went to. There was only one secondary school in the catchment area that included our neighborhood. He said he went there. I told him I went there too. We both went quiet, trying to find overlap. We couldn't find any. Not a single teacher in common. Not a class. Not an assembly. Not a face in the hallway. The school wasn't large. I pushed a little. He got slightly tense and changed the subject, and I let it drop because honestly, they talked to me. And that was still more than most people offered. About 3 weeks in, I mentioned that I needed to go home for dinner and asked if anyone wanted me to bring something back. Simple enough. The reaction was immediate and out of proportion. Not angry exactly, but rigid. Sylvie said something about how she didn't feel comfortable accepting things from across the creek. Teddy looked at the ground. Rory said they were superstitious about boundary lines between properties. Old family thing, not worth explaining. I backed off and didn't push it. When I came back without offering anything, the tension dissolved and we had a good evening. Then one afternoon I arrived at the clearing and something was wrong. All 3 of them looked ill. Rory had dark circles that hadn't been there the day before. Teddy was moving slowly, carefully, the way you move when your whole body hurts. But Sylvie was the worst. Her skin had changed. Not sick pale, but something else, something I struggled to name. It was shiny in the wrong way, and slightly damp looking, and the color was off, like color seen through frosted glass. Her hair, which had always been perfectly neat, was lank and stuck to the side of her face. Her clothes, which had always looked impossibly new, looked ruined. Not dirty, just wrong somehow, as though the material itself had changed. I asked what had happened. They said they'd all come down with the same thing. A bug going around. I stayed for an hour or 2, but the energy was wrong, and eventually they said they should probably head home. Sylvie said she'd see me in a couple of days. Teddy and Rory left without saying much, both of them coughing in a way that sounded deep and wet and persistent. I mentioned the 3 of them to my mother that night. She said it was good I'd found kids to spend time with, and she didn't ask many more questions. The voices from the tree line had stopped at this point. No more sounds in the evening. Nothing. 2 days later, I crossed the creek with a bag of tools and went back to the clearing. The fort was gone. Not vandalized. Not dismantled. I want to be precise about this because dismantled would mean the materials were somewhere, stacked or scattered. There were no materials. There were the remains of materials. The walls had collapsed and were sinking into the ground, and the wood, which had been fresh-cut birch less than 48 hours before, was black with rot, soft and crumbling where I touched it. The table was a shape on the ground more than a table. The platform had come down from the birch tree and was half buried already in a thick mulch of decay. There was moss on things that hadn't had time to grow moss. There was fungus on surfaces I had sanded smooth with my own hands. It looked like it had been sitting abandoned for 20 or 30 years. I went back the next day, and the day after. I went back every day for 2 weeks. I walked the logging roads, looking for any sign of them. They had mentioned living up the hill somewhere, but they'd never shown me exactly where. And when I walked the hill, I found nothing that helped. No one I asked in town recognized their descriptions. I eventually let it go. I was sad about it for a long time. The way you're sad about something you can't properly explain even to yourself. I'm 31 now. A few months ago, I was telling my wife Clara about that autumn, about Teddy and Rory and Sylvie, about the fort and the tools and the afternoons. It's a good memory overall, the kind with a confusing ending that doesn't diminish what came before it. Clara listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and said, "You know they were ghosts." I told her that was a bit of a leap. She started listing things quietly, the way she does when she's already thought something through. Nobody else ever saw them, only heard them. My parents, who were curious about the voices, never once actually laid eyes on them despite weeks of opportunity. No records, no enrollment at the school we both supposedly attended, no house I could ever locate, an absolute refusal to cross the water, which she pointed out has been consistent in ghost folklore across dozens of cultures for thousands of years, and the fort, which didn't decay, which had already decayed, which was not destroyed but returned, rapidly and completely, to the state it would have been in if 30 years had passed. I've turned it over many times since. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure I need one. Whatever they were the first people in a long time who were genuinely glad to see me when I showed up. That part, at least, was real. Clara thinks they were kids who died in those woods sometime in the 80s, still out there on the trails, still building things, still looking for someone to help. I think if she's right, I hope they found someone else after me. I hope they're still building.